Have you ever wondered why Canada's, well, calculated response to intense trade pressure could completely change how we look at North American economic power? For decades, the story was pretty much dependency, right? Washington sets the pace, calls the shots for North American industry.
Yeah, but that narrative is rapidly shifting, fundamentally shifting, actually. We're now seeing this transition where Canada's moved beyond just, reacting to tariffs and trade friction. It's launched a coordinated, proactive strategy aimed squarely at achieving, well, industrial independence.
And that pivot is exactly what we're exploring today. Canada, facing these ongoing trade headaches, duties, attempts at political leverage from its biggest partner, basically said, okay, fine, we'll just systematically build our own resilient economic backbone.
Exactly. And this transformation, it's guided by resilience. It's not simple retaliation. We can break this national pivot down into, say, three core pillars. There's strategic investment in next-gen energy, especially small modular reactors, SMRs, then aggressively leveraging control over critical mineral supply chains, and finally, cultivating the systemic trade and, interestingly, cultural diversification away from the U.S.
Okay, lots to unpack there. Before we get into the details, remember that insights like these really rely on your engagement.
Right. So let's start with that first pillar. It's arguably the most ambitious one, the massive nuclear bet.
Yeah, we're talking about the Darlington new nuclear project in Ontario. And this is, it's much more than just an energy project, isn't it? It feels like a profound statement of intent. Canada's building the first operational small modular reactor in the entire G7. I mean, ahead of the Americans, the French, the British. That's significant.
It absolutely is. It's a declaration of Canada's intent to lead its own clean industrial future. And the scale, well, it's staggering. Yeah. The total cost is estimated around 21 billion Canadian dollars. When all four units are done, probably mid-2030s, they're set to generate 1,200 megawatts of electricity.
Hold on, $21 billion. That's a massive public investment. Is there much political or, financial pushback on that scale of spending, or does the promise of long-term jobs kind of smooth that over?
Well, the long-term impact is definitely key to neutralizing that criticism.
Yeah.
Ontario Power Generation, OPG, they forecast this build will sustain about 3,700 jobs every single year for the next 65 years.
Wow, 65 years.
Yeah. You're looking at one of the longest, most reliable industrial employment pipelines in the country's history, really. That kind of long-term economic stability, it tends to build pretty broad political consensus.
Okay, makes sense. But what's the strategic industrial benefit of these SMRs compared to traditional nuclear plants? Beyond just being smaller, I mean.
The difference is revolutionary. Really. SMRs are designed for factory production. Standardized components, manufactured, then shipped to the site.
Right, modular.
Exactly. This speeds up construction dramatically, potentially lowers costs, and crucially, they incorporate inherent passive safety features, meaning they don't rely on complex active systems or, human intervention in an emergency.
Oh, cool.
This makes the technology much more palatable for decentralized energy needs, speeds up adoption. It's a real technological and industrial leap.
But wait, this sounds almost perfect. Is there a catch? Any lingering strategic Achilles heel in this massive domestic project?
There is, yeah, and it's a significant one, the fuel. Canada can't yet produce enriched uranium domestically, so under the current setup, uranium mined in Saskatchewan has to be shipped down to the U.S. for enrichment.
And then shipped back to Canada for use in the reactor.
Preci-
Okay, so if the whole point is industrial independence, that dependency on the U.S. for enrichment, it just instantly creates potential leverage, right? Washington could interrupt that flow anytime under a strict America First policy.
Exactly, and this isn't just theoretical. Washington has shown willingness to use resource dependency as leverage elsewhere. But the response to this vulnerability is what really signals that pivot to independence. OPG moved fast. They immediately started talks with a French supplier to diversify their supply.
Smart.
And they actively encouraged the federal government to fast-track exploring future domestic enrichment capacity.
So the pressure from Washington, maybe intended to keep Canada dependent, is ironically pushing Ottawa to speed up, close those strategic gaps, and get more self-reliant in the nuclear fuel cycle.
Like a classic case of unintended consequences sparking accelerated innovation, yeah. What started as a weak link is driving them towards complete independence faster.
Okay, securing power is step one. But to really control the future energy and tech revolution, you need control of the inputs, right? Which brings us to pillar number two. critical minerals. And here, the strategy shifted from maybe confrontation to calculated ownership.
Yes, this is where we see a really fascinating paradox. The U.S. government, instead of just regulating or tariffing, it quietly bought equity stakes in Canadian mining firms. They picked up 10% of Trilogy metals for about $35.6 million and 5% of Vancouver-based Lithium Americas.
Right. The U.S. motive seems pretty clear there. Secure access to resources like lithium, vital for national security, defense, batteries, and crucially reduce that deep dependence on China, which controls so much global battery production.
Absolutely. But here's the sort of geopolitical novelty. The U.S. entered Canada's industrial scene not as a dominant regulator, but as a minority shareholder. And this, perhaps unexpectedly, benefits Canada. Well, even as a shareholder, the U.S. is bound by Canadian laws, environmental oversight, permitting procedures. Canada keeps full sovereignty over the deposits, the permits, and, this is key, the crucial processing and refining facilities.
Ah, so owning shares doesn't mean controlling the rules of the game on Canadian soil.
Exactly. And it actually commits the U.S. to the long-term stability of Canadian policy. If you own 10% of the firm, you're incentivized to see the project succeed under Canadian governance. It kind of locks the American government into supporting Canada's mining rules rather than fighting them.
And this leads right to Canada's maybe irreplaceable advantage, control over the processing bottleneck. Like you said, it doesn't matter who owns the raw dirt if you own the factory that turns it into something useful.
Precisely. Canada's plants process things like zinc and germanium, essential ingredients for semiconductors, high-performance batteries, advanced defense systems. The U.S. might own some shares in the mines, but Canada owns that industrial processing bottleneck that makes the raw resources actually usable.
And we should probably mention these assets are part of Canada's broader nation-building project's vision. What does that involve exactly?
It's this vision focused on building an integrated modern industrial ecosystem. It includes projects in remote areas like McKelvin Bay, the Red Chris copper mine, and exploring the Ring of Fire, that vast, untapped mineral resource area in northern Ontario. The goal is a complete mine-to-market supply chain to break global imbalances, offer a clean, reliable, ethically sourced alternative to Europe and the U.S. The consequence: leverage. Economic power now flows much more robustly both ways across the border.
Okay, let's shift now to the immediate trade friction. What happened when those U.S. tariffs hit, some ranging from 10% up to 50% on steel and aluminum? Washington clearly intended to slow Canada down, but the result was a pretty significant unintended consequence. It actually accelerated diversification.
Yes, and this gives us a measurable answer to that question. Did the tariffs achieve compliance, or did they just redefine the relationship? The data, the measurable results, strongly suggest they redefined it. They pushed Canadian industry outward.
The numbers are quite remarkable, aren't they? Canadian exports to the UK, for instance, jumped a massive 63% in value. That single leap made the UK Canada's second largest trading partner, displacing China.
Yeah, huge jump. And that shift wasn't just corporate. It extended down to consumers, too. Cross-border car travel dropped 35%. Air travel to U.S. cities fell 25% year over year. And domestically, U.S. businesses felt it. American liquor sales in Canada plunged 62%.
62%? That's not a blip.
No. It was sharp enough to force profit warnings for major U.S. companies, including distillers.
And I find that cultural distancing part fascinating, too. Even culture shifted. Sales of Canadian-authored books rose 25%. CBC Gem streaming surged 34%.
It shows how what began as an attempt to squeeze Canadian industry is actually eroding the American commercial and even cultural presence north of the border. It's making Canada demonstrably more self-reliant, less dependent on its neighbor for goods and entertainment.
Okay, if you're finding these insights useful, maybe take a second to support this work. It really motivates us to keep sharing more research stories like this one.
Right. Let's turn now to a shared crisis: housing affordability. Both countries face the same, spiraling problem, but their policy responses are radically different. And it really highlights their underlying economic philosophies.
So in the U.S., the trade stance on Canadian softwood lumber, it remains extremely punitive, right? They apply both countervailing duties, arguing Canadian lumber is unfairly subsidized, and anti-dumping rates. The latest review put average duties near 14.63%, with anti-dumping rates over 20%. Ouch.
Yeah, and American builders, including the National Association of Home Builders, they argue these tariffs are just a structural headwind. The duties get added at the border, raising prices for wholesalers, which then increases material costs for builders. This, they argue, feeds directly into higher home prices, making affordability worse, making it harder to deliver those entry-level homes south of the border. So tariffs, in this case, just increase domestic costs for Americans.
Meanwhile, the Canadian response is, well, it's a direct application of that industrial independence idea we've been talking about. They're deploying strategic public investment.
Exactly. That's the core of their Build Canada Homes initiative. Starts with $13 billion in federal funding. The main mission is doubling the pace of construction, mostly through modular and factory-built homes. They're aiming to cut typical construction costs by up to 20%.
And crucially, the Canadian plan prioritizes strengthening domestic supply chains. The plan explicitly mandates prioritizing Canadian steel, aluminum, and timber. So while the U.S. keeps tariffs that raise costs for its own people, Canada is using massive public investment to actively lower costs and increase accessibility, using its own resources to solve its own problems.
The contrast is stark, isn't it? The U.S. seems to view tariffs primarily as trade leverage, even if it harms domestic consumers. Canada sees strategic public investment and controlling its domestic supply chain as the path to sovereignty and affordability.
So, stepping back and looking at all these strategic moves, the nuclear bet, controlling critical minerals, prioritizing domestic materials for housing, what does this really mean for the balance of power?
I think it means Canada's blueprint for industrial sovereignty is built on, well, strategic depth and long-term resilience. By pioneering SMRs, they secure long-term clean energy. By locking down the critical mineral supply chain and that processing bottleneck, they make themselves indispensable to both the U.S. and Europe. And by prioritizing domestic investment, they strengthen their internal market against external shocks. The advantage, quietly, maybe, but decisively, has shifted north.
It raises a big question then. When economic power is tied not just to tariffs and trade flows, but to owning resources, resilient infrastructure, strategic self-reliance, how does a superpower truly measure dominance anymore? Is vulnerability just an inevitable consequence of depending on global supply chains, even for the most powerful nation? That's really the question Canada's pivot forces us all to consider.
It absolutely forces everyone to reevaluate where true economic resilience lies in the 21st century. It's not just about size anymore.
So what's your take on this? We'd love to hear your point of view, and if you haven't already, please support this channel so you don't miss future insights like these.